I loved in silence, waited in shadows, and broke unseen. My name is Nicole. I'm 20, 3 years old, and I've always believed that love was something you give without keeping score. I never wanted grand gestures or declarations shouted from rooftops. I just wanted to be seen, for who I was, for what I carried inside, for the way I quietly showed up, over and over again. I gave everything quietly, not because I didn't feel deeply, but because I did. And I thought if I loved hard enough in silence, the right heart would hear it. I thought if I poured my soul into the small things, the soft encouragements, the long listening, the waiting without complaints, someone would notice the language of my affection. I remember how I'd sit across from him, watching his eyes flicker with frustration or weariness after a long day, and I'd just be there. Not to fix, not to lecture, just to hold space. I didn't interrupt. I didn't demand. I gave him quiet company, thinking that was enough. I hoped the stillness I offered would feel like safety to him, something he'd come to value. There were days when I would send him texts just to remind him he mattered. Little things like, "I hope today is lighter for you," or "Don't forget to drink water." I didn't need a reply. I just wanted him to know someone was thinking of him. That was my love language. Unspoken, consistent, and soft. I noticed everything. The way his shoulders tensed when he was overthinking. The way he ran his fingers along the rim of a glass when he was deep in thought. I didn't ask him to open up when he didn't want to. I waited. I believed people unfolded in their own time, and I wanted to be the kind of person he could unfold around. When he forgot important things I mentioned, I smiled and said, "It's okay." When he showed up late or changed plans last minute, I told myself he must be overwhelmed and I shouldn't add to it. I let it slide again and again because I thought that's what love did. It understood. But understanding turned into invisibility. My quiet giving became background noise. I started to realize I was offering pieces of myself to someone who never asked what it cost me to keep giving. I'd listen to him for hours, but when I tried to speak, it felt like my voice dissolved before it reached him. He would nod, but his eyes would drift elsewhere. He would say, "That sucks," and then change the subject. And still I stayed, because I hoped. I hoped that one day he'd turn to me and really see, that he'd recognize the strength it took to love in silence, that he'd see my presence not as something guaranteed, but something sacred. I didn't want to be worshipped. I just wanted to be acknowledged, noticed, loved back. But the thing is, when you give everything quietly, people assume you have nothing to lose. They assume your silence means satisfaction, and your patience means indifference. They don't always realize that quiet love is still love, and that hearts can break without making a sound. I remember one night we sat on his couch, and he talked about someone else, someone who had recently caught his attention. He said her name with this softness that I had never heard when he said mine, and I laughed, that hollow kind of laugh you give when you're trying not to look broken. He didn't notice. He just kept talking. And I realized I could be sitting right next to someone and still feel miles away. That's when it hit me. I had built a home in someone who never intended to stay. I had stitched comfort into every word, every look, every quiet act of care. And he never even realized it was love. So I stopped talking so much. I stopped checking in. I stopped giving without pause, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Because love should not ask you to disappear in order to be accepted. And maybe he never meant to hurt me. Maybe he simply never looked hard enough to see that I was hurting. But I was, quietly, deeply, every day. I gave everything quietly, expecting nothing but to be seen. People always told me I had a warm smile. They said it lit up rooms, softened edges, made them feel safe. I heard it so often, I started to believe it was the best part of me. What they never knew, what no one ever asked, was what it cost me to keep smiling that way. Every smile I wore was stitched with silent ache. I smiled through the loneliness, through the confusion, through the 1,000 little moments that made me feel like I wasn't enough, like I was too easy to forget. I smiled when plans were broken without apology, when words that should have been soft came out sharp, when my feelings were brushed aside like a passing inconvenience. It was easier to smile than to explain the weight I was carrying. I didn't want to be the dramatic one. I didn't want to seem needy. So I bit down the words, curled up the corners of my lips, and convinced myself it was better to be quiet than to be misunderstood. There were times I'd catch my own reflection and wonder who I was trying to convince. Him, myself, the world. I'd laugh at his jokes even when they stung. I'd say it's okay when it wasn't. I'd smile through tears that never made it out of my eyes. I remember one day we were out, surrounded by people, and he barely looked at me. His attention kept drifting elsewhere. His phone, the people passing by, anything but me. But I still smiled. I smiled so no one would see the way I was unraveling. Because I didn't want to embarrass him. Because I didn't want to make things harder. Because I thought love meant always holding things together, even if it meant coming undone in private. He would sometimes say, "You're so strong," and I'd nod. But strength wasn't the reason I stayed silent. It was fear. Fear that if I let the truth out, it would chase him away. Fear that if I showed the ache behind the smile, he'd call it too much. So I stitched my ache into silence, into polite nods, into carefully worded replies, into quiet understanding. I carried disappointments like secrets, tucked beneath practiced expressions and measured responses. There were moments I wanted to scream, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. I wanted to ask, "Do you see me at all? Do you notice how hard I try to make this easy for you?" But instead, I smiled. I kept everything soft, everything small, so he'd never feel the weight I was carrying. But just because I carried it well doesn't mean it wasn't heavy. I started to feel like a background character in my own life, like I was there to support, to listen, to stay in place while he moved freely, unburdened. I wondered if he ever looked at me and saw more than convenience, more than someone who would never challenge him, never make demands. I wondered if he ever truly saw me, or just the version of me that was easiest to love. He once said, "I like that you're low maintenance." It wasn't a compliment, it was a confirmation that I had succeeded in being easy, in hiding everything that might make me hard to love. But love shouldn't mean hiding. And slowly, the smiles began to hurt. I felt them stretch over pain that never left. I felt them falter in moments when I could no longer pretend. I'd excuse myself to the bathroom just to breathe, just to fall apart in silence, then wipe my face clean and return to the world like nothing had cracked. I started to resent how natural it became, how I could smile while my heart was sinking. I hated that no one questioned it, that no one asked, "Are you okay?" in a way that felt like they truly wanted to know. Maybe if someone had, I would have broken. Maybe I would have finally said, "No, I'm not. I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of loving like this." But no one did. And I kept smiling, because sometimes it feels safer to be silent than to risk being seen, and still not matter. My love was never loud. It didn't arrive with declarations or ultimatums. It didn't ask for center stage or expect to be repaid. It moved in quiet ways, subtle, unnoticed, often misunderstood, but it was real and it was steady. I never asked him to prove anything. I never told him to say the words I longed to hear. I just showed up. Again and again, I stayed when things got messy. I paid attention to the little details, remembered the things he didn't think were important. I noticed the way he liked his coffee, the way his voice changed when he was tired, the way he got quiet when something was weighing on him but didn't know how to say it. I didn't try to fix him. I just tried to make him feel safe. My love wasn't in grand gestures. It was in warming his hands when they were cold. It was in answering his late night calls even when I was half-asleep. It was in letting him talk, even when his words were sharp and unfair, because I knew they were rooted in something deeper. I didn't demand his time. I made space for it. I didn't count the ways I showed I cared. I just did. I ran errands when he was overwhelmed, covered for his mistakes when I could, reminded him of who he was when he forgot. And I never asked for anything in return. Maybe that was my mistake, believing that love given so fully would eventually be seen and felt and returned. But I didn't know how else to love. I didn't know how to be the girl who begged for attention, who made ultimatums, who asked, "What about me?" Because for me, love was always something you gave from the inside out, not something you traded, not something you kept score over. I loved in the way I showed up, in the way I softened my voice when he was upset, in the way I waited patiently for him to let me in, thinking eventually he would. But I don't think he ever really noticed, or maybe he did, and just didn't care enough to hold it. Maybe he liked being loved without having to give much back. Maybe it made things easier for him to be on the receiving end of someone else's devotion without ever being expected to meet it. There were so many moments I wanted to say something, to ask him if he even realized how much I gave, how much I held back just to make things smoother for him. But I didn't. I kept it quiet. I thought if I had to explain it, maybe he wouldn't understand it anyway. I'd be the one to pick up the pieces when he was scattered. I'd be the one to remember his important dates, even when he forgot mine. I'd be the one waiting when he needed space without a single complaint. And even in the silence, even in the waiting, even in the one-sided conversations, I thought maybe my presence would speak loud enough. But love doesn't always get noticed just because it's loyal. I began to realize I was giving a kind of love he didn't know how to value. He wanted attention, excitement, the kind of love that demanded things, shook things up, made noise. But I wasn't noise. I was the quiet, the constant, the calm. I was love in its softest form. I thought that mattered. I thought being steady would count for something, but it didn't, at least not to him. There were times he'd say, "You never ask for anything. I don't even know what you want." And I would smile, a little sad, because I didn't want things. I just wanted to be seen. I wanted him to look at all the things I never said and know exactly what they meant. I wanted him to realize that love can speak without shouting, that actions, when rooted in genuine care, say more than demands ever could. But he never really heard it. And maybe that's the part that hurts the most. Not that he didn't love me back, but that he didn't even recognize the way I loved him. I used to wonder if anyone really saw me. I mean, truly saw me, not just the version of me that made things easier for them. I showed up for people without hesitation. I was the one who remembered their favorite songs, who noticed when their voice wavered even slightly, who sat beside them in silence when words felt too heavy. I didn't need attention. I didn't need to be praised for what I did. I just wanted to matter. But the truth is, they noticed my absence more than my presence. When I was there, everything felt expected. Normal, I was the one who always replied first, who made the plans, who followed up when they forgot, who gave without making a scene about it. I made it too easy to be taken for granted, and they did. Every single time. I think somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that love meant being consistent, no matter how invisible that consistency made me feel. I remember how I would walk into a room and smile, even when I was exhausted, even when I had cried just hours before. No one ever asked if I was okay. Maybe they thought I always was. Maybe they thought because I carried things quietly, I never needed anyone to carry me. But when I stopped showing up, the silence became loud. Suddenly there were questions. Are you okay? Where have you been? We haven't seen you in a while. Not out of concern, but out of surprise. Like they only remembered I existed when the rhythm of convenience was interrupted. Like I had been a part of the background, and now that the background was missing, they didn't know how to function without it. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. To know that I could be so present in people's lives and yet so invisible. That my worth only seemed to rise when I pulled away. That they only noticed I was hurting when I became silent enough to make them uncomfortable. I think what broke me wasn't their lack of appreciation. It was the realization that I had spent so much time trying to be someone they'd never bother to understand. I was never loud. I never made demands. I never forced myself into their lives. I just kept giving, hoping one day someone would look up and realize I had always been there. But most people don't notice what's constant. They don't stop to appreciate what doesn't ask to be seen. They only look when something is missing, and by then, it's already too late. I started to feel like I was only valuable when I removed myself, that my silence had more impact than my presence ever did. And that realization, it changed me. I stopped trying so hard to be everything for everyone. I stopped pouring myself into spaces where I was just a placeholder. I let the absence speak because my presence never did. It's a lonely thing, loving people who don't realize you're loving them. It's lonelier when you finally walk away, and the only thing they miss is how easy you made their lives. Not you, not your heart, just your convenience. I never wanted to be loud. I never wanted to demand space. I just wanted someone to notice me while I was still standing there, while I was still reaching out, while I was still holding everything together in the quiet way that I always had. But they never did, and now I know. It's not that I was too quiet. It's that they never listened. I was never the one people ran to first. I was the quiet kind, the one who stood slightly behind, watching everything, feeling everything, hoping someone would turn around and see me there. I didn't chase attention. I didn't fight to be heard. I simply waited. I told myself the right person would notice me without needing to be told where to look. So I waited to be chosen, even in the shadows. It wasn't just about wanting love. It was about wanting to matter, deeply and fully, to someone who would look past the noise and see what I offered in silence. I watched him give his time to others, watched his eyes light up in conversations where I didn't exist, and still I stayed. I told myself he was just distracted, that he had too much on his plate, that he needed time, and so I gave it to him, time, space, understanding, everything I had, without ever asking for anything in return. But inside I was aching, because waiting can be a kind of heartbreak too, especially when you're waiting in the background, in the soft corners of someone else's world. hoping they'll turn around and realize you were there all along. I supported him in ways I never named. I celebrated his wins, even when they came with no acknowledgement of my part in them. I stayed up late listening to his worries, even when mine went unspoken. I showed up to things he barely invited me to, just in case my presence might mean something if I was there enough times. I thought maybe love could be earned through patience. Maybe if I kept showing I was there, he'd one day say, "It's you. You're the one I've been needing." But he never did. I remember one evening we were out with friends and someone asked him who he trusted most. I looked at him without even thinking, already knowing my answer. But he named someone else, someone who hadn't seen him at his worst, someone who wasn't there during the long, hard nights when he could barely speak. I smiled anyway. I always smiled, but my heart sank, because I realized in that moment how invisible I was to him. Not because I didn't care, not because I didn't love enough, but because I made it too easy to overlook me. I stayed quiet, thinking my consistency would speak louder than words. I thought my love would bloom in the space where I never asked for anything. I thought not asking meant I would be chosen freely. But love doesn't work that way. You can't be chosen by someone who never looked for you. And still I waited. I waited through cancelled plans, through half-rip lies, through vague promises of someday. I waited while he poured himself into people who only liked him in fragments. I waited while he looked past me to chase what sparkled on the surface, not realizing that I was holding something deep, something steady, something real. There were moments I almost spoke up, almost asked him if he ever thought of me the way I thought of him. But I didn't want to push him. I didn't want to ruin what little space I had beside him. So I stayed in the shadows, where it was safe to love without expectation, where I could hold on to the hope that one day he'd wake up and see that the one who never walked away was the one who loved him most. But time has a way of peeling away illusions. I started to realize that waiting wasn't noble. It was painful. That love shouldn't feel like a constant ache. That the right person wouldn't need to be convinced. That being chosen shouldn't come after being ignored. I gave so much of myself in silence, in patience, in long nights spent wondering if I meant anything more than convenience. I hoped he'd see the value of the quiet love I offered. But he never did. And the hardest part wasn't that he chose someone else. It's that he never even looked in my direction. There were days I felt completely invisible. Not in the dramatic way people throw the word around, but in the slow, aching kind of way that builds over time, when your presence is acknowledged, but your heart is never asked about. I was always there, always showing up, always the one to check in, to ask how they were, to make sure no one felt alone. But no one ever paused long enough to look me in the eyes and say, "And what about you?" When no one asked how I felt, I still stayed. It wasn't because I didn't have feelings. I had more than I knew what to do with. I just got used to folding them up, tucking them away where they wouldn't make things harder for anyone else. I told myself people were busy, that they had enough going on. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want my sadness, my confusion, my quiet disappointments to take up space in their already full lives. So I held it all in, even with him. I stayed. I gave without expecting much. I listened more than I spoke. I made space for his worries, his moods, his silence, and when he was distant, when he forgot to ask how I was or notice how my energy shifted, I forgave it. I excused it. I told myself it wasn't intentional, that maybe if I kept loving him softly, steadily, he'd eventually look back and wonder how I was really doing beneath the surface of all my "I'm fine"s. I became an expert in erasure, smiling when I felt empty, laughing when I wanted to cry, offering comfort when I desperately needed some of my own. I carried the weight of everyone else's emotions like it was my role in life. I was the strong one, the grounded one, the one who never asked for anything too loudly. But I was breaking quietly, slowly. I remember nights when I would lie awake, wondering what it would feel like to be held without having to ask for it. To have someone just notice that something was off and care enough to pull me close and say, "Talk to me. Tell me what's hurting." I wasn't expecting anyone to fix me. I just wanted to feel chosen, emotionally, spiritually. I wanted to matter enough for someone to notice the parts of me that were unraveling behind my quiet strength. He never did. He'd talk about his day, his frustrations, his dreams, and I'd listen with everything in me. I'd memorize the way his voice shifted, the words he didn't say. I gave him all my attention, hoping my silence would be enough for him to turn around and ask, "And you, how are you really doing?" But he never did. It was always about him, about the world spinning around him, and I remained in the orbit, unseen, unheard. But I still stayed, not because I didn't know I deserved more, but because love, to me, meant being there when it mattered. I thought that by holding steady, by being the one he could rely on, I was showing him the kind of love that lasts, the kind that doesn't leave just because it feels unappreciated. I believed in some quiet place inside of me that eventually he'd open his eyes and see that I was the one who never looked away. But the truth is, being there for everyone while no one is there for you will hollow you out. I kept pouring from a cup that no one thought to refill. I kept making room for their needs while mine sat in silence, waiting, hoping. I think what hurt most wasn't that no one asked, it's that I stopped expecting them to. I started convincing myself that being needed was enough. That maybe being the one they leaned on, even without acknowledgement, meant I was valued in some way. But love without reciprocity is just endurance. And I endured far more than I ever should have. I still believe in love that asks, that listens, that sees. I still believe in showing up for people. But I've learned that showing up for others should never cost you the parts of yourself that quietly cry out to be held to. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't staying through the silence. It's finally choosing to be the one who listens to yourself. I gave everything I had, soft words I never said, kindness I never asked to be returned, love I never made loud. I stayed when no one noticed. I waited when no one came. I smiled through ache, listened through silence, and stood in the shadows, hoping someone would reach for me. But I've realized something now. Love shouldn't feel like waiting to be seen. It shouldn't be earned through pain or proven through absence. I mattered, even if they didn't say it. I felt deeply, even if no one asked. And just because they didn't choose me doesn't mean I wasn't worth choosing. So this is good. Bye not to the love I gave, but to the silence I lived in, to the ache I wore quietly, to the shadows I stood in too long. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm walking toward the light where I don't have to be louder to be loved. Where presence is seen, where feeling is mutual, where love finally loves me back. Good bye to who I was, and hello to who I'm finally becoming.